97 cabins showed up on the ridge above my lake, and somehow the people who built them believed the water belonged to everyone. That was the first thing that made my stomach drop. The second was the brochure. It said Lake Living in big, confident letters, with a sunrise photo that might as well have been taken from my own dock. I remember standing on the east bank one early September morning, coffee in hand, mist lifting off the surface like it always does when the air turns cool, and looking up at that ridge where there used to be nothing but pine and scrub oak. Now there were rooftops, fresh lumber, the whine of nail guns echoing across water that has carried my family name longer than I have been alive. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't scare easy, but something about it felt like someone had moved a fence in the night and hoped I wouldn't notice. My name's Daniel Mercer. The lake is Alder Creek Lake, though the county maps label it Mercer Basin Reservoir, which always makes it sound bigger than it is. It's not some sprawling Great Lakes situation. It's about 30 acres, deep in the center, fed by a cold spring that runs year-round, even in August when everything else around here turns brittle and yellow. My grandfather bought this land in 1958 when it was nothing but timber and rock. He wasn't rich, just stubborn, and he had a thing about water. Said if you controlled water, you controlled your future. He made sure when he bought it that he didn't just get the dirt around the edges. He secured the surface rights, the subsurface rights, the inflow channels from the spring, and the spillway we use to control the level in heavy rain. I've seen the original deed. It's typed on thick paper that smells like old libraries, signed in blue ink that has faded but not disappeared. Shoreline, basin, water column, mineral bed, controlled outflow. It's all there. My grandfather used to say, if it touches the water, it touches us. My dad kept it the same way. No jet skis, no public access, no parties. We let a few neighbors fish if they asked politely and closed the gate behind them. We maintained the spillway ourselves, cleared brush, tested the water quality twice a year. It wasn't just a pretty view. It was liability, insurance, maintenance, responsibility. Water is quiet until it isn't. So when Timber Crest Development bought the hills west of us and announced a luxury cabin community, I didn't panic. People buy land. People build things. That's America. What I didn't expect was how aggressively they leaned on the lake in their marketing. The first time I saw one of their signs was at the gas station in town. A glossy poster taped to the bulletin board. Timber Crest Retreats. Lake-adjacent living. Private cabin community with direct access to nature. There was my lake in the background, orange sunset, someone in a kayak near the reeds by the North Cove. I stared at it longer than I probably should have. The clerk, Marlene, leaned over and said, "Pretty, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said. "That's my lake." She laughed like I was joking. At first, it was just footpaths, narrow cuts through the brush on the ridge sloping down toward the western shoreline. I'd noticed trampled grass where there hadn't been any before. A candy wrapper near the waterline. I told myself it was hikers who got turned around. It happens. Then came the portable docks. Cheap aluminum frames dragged down in sections, assembled right at the water's edge like someone setting up lawn furniture. I found one anchored near the shallow inlet one Saturday morning. Two guys in their 30s were tightening bolts. "Morning," I called out. They looked up, surprised but not guilty, like they assumed I was just another resident. "Beautiful spot," one of them said. "We closed on cabin 14 last week. Couldn't wait to get the dock in." I walked down the bank slow, not wanting to start something I couldn't finish. "That dock," I said, "that's on private water." They glanced at each other. "HOA said we had lake privileges," the other one replied. "It's part of the community amenities." I almost laughed, but it didn't feel funny. "The HOA doesn't own this lake," I said. "My family does." They weren't hostile, just confused, which, in a way, made it worse. Someone had told them a story that wasn't true, and now I was the inconvenient fact. That night, I pulled out the file cabinet in my office and laid everything on the desk. The deed. The survey from 1987 when my dad had the boundaries reconfirmed. The more recent one I ordered after he passed. The language was airtight. No recorded easements. No shared access agreements. No public designation. Private lake classification confirmed by the county. I drafted a letter to the Timber Crest Homeowners Association Board. Polite, measured, not accusatory. I attached copies of the deed and the survey maps with the shoreline clearly marked. I wrote that while I understood the desire for recreation, the shoreline and water surface were privately owned and not included in any of their property purchases. I asked them to remove any structures and cease implying access. 2 weeks later, I received their response. It was signed by a man named Bryce Holloway, HOA president. The tone was friendly in that way that feels rehearsed. Mr. Mercer, Timbercrest has long understood Alder Creek Lake to be a natural amenity serving the broader valley community. Our residents have engaged in customary recreational use consistent with local practice. Customary use. I read that line 3 times. Custom doesn't override a deed. Not in this state. I drove up to the Timbercrest Clubhouse the following Thursday evening. They were holding a board meeting. I wasn't on the agenda, but I figured if they were going to reference local practice, we could at least discuss what local meant. The room smelled like new carpet and coffee. About 30 residents sat in folding chairs. Bryce Holloway stood at the front. Mid-40s, expensive watch, smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mr. Mercer, he said when he saw me, we were just discussing the lake situation. I bet you were, I replied. He gestured for me to come up front. We believe, he began, that the lake has historically functioned as a shared natural feature. Our marketing reflected the lifestyle of the area, not a specific legal claim. Your brochure shows kayaks on my water, I said. That's a specific claim. A murmur moved through the room. Bryce kept smiling. We're open to a cooperative solution. I remember looking around at the faces in that room. Young couples, retirees, a few families with kids. They weren't villains. They bought into a dream. But that dream had been built on my grandfather's paperwork. This isn't about cooperation, I said. It's about ownership. And ownership is documented. The meeting ended without resolution. A week later, a permanent dock appeared, anchored straight into the lake bed. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. That dock went in on a Tuesday. I know that because I remember the sound. Metal biting into lake bedrock has a particular echo. It carries across water in a way chainsaws don't. I was down by the spillway checking the gate after a heavy rain when I heard it, a hollow, grinding thud that didn't belong there. By the time I walked around the southern curve, they had a crew of 4 out there in waders, driving steel posts into the bottom like they were planting a flag. The structure stretched 20 feet out, wide enough for 6 or 7 kayaks to tie off. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't confused. It was deliberate. One of the workers saw me and waved like we were neighbors building a fence together. You Daniel? He shouted. Yeah, we got authorization from Timbercrest HOA. This is a shared community dock. Not on this water, it isn't. He shrugged, the way contractors do when the argument isn't their paycheck. You got to take that up with Bryce. I stood there longer than I should have, watching each post disappear into sediment my grandfather once dredged by hand with a rented pump and more determination than money. I felt something shift inside me. Up until then, I'd been writing letters, explaining maps, assuming this was a paperwork problem. But steel in the lake bed is not paperwork. It's intent. That night, I called an attorney. Her name is Laura Benton. Mid-50s, sharp as broken glass when she needs to be, but patient in the way only someone who's read thousands of deeds can be. She specializes in water rights and riparian boundary disputes. Around here, that's a niche field, but if you grow up in a valley built on irrigation and reservoirs, you learn fast that water law is its own universe. I laid everything out for her the next morning in her office. Deeds, surveys, the HOA letter, photos of the dock. She didn't interrupt, just flipped through pages, adjusted her glasses, and nodded occasionally. When she finished, she leaned back. Daniel, she said, this is clean. Your grandfather did this right. Surface rights, subsurface, inflow, outflow, no easements recorded. The lake is classified as private under county code. There is no gray area here. Then why do they think they can build on it? Because, she said, most people don't expect the owner to push back. That landed heavier than I expected. She explained something I hadn't thought about. Developers sometimes blur lines intentionally. If enough residents use something long enough without objection, they start whispering about prescriptive rights, customary use, implied easements. It's not automatic, and it's not easy to prove, but the longer it goes unchallenged, the more complicated it becomes. You were smart to send that letter early, she said. But the dock changes the stakes. So what's next? We document everything. Then we file formal notice of trespass and unlawful use of private water resources. And we set a deadline. I hired a licensed surveyor named Miguel Santos, a quiet guy who carried his equipment like it was an extension of his body. We spent 2 full days mapping every encroachment. The dock, the anchor points, the cleared footpaths, even a set of stone steps someone had started cutting into the western bank. Miguel stood at the waterline, tripod planted, calling out measurements while I held markers. "You'd be surprised how often this happens," he said. "People see water and assume it's public. It's not a sidewalk," I muttered. "Nope. But folks don't read deeds. They read brochures." When Laura filed the notice, it wasn't dramatic. Just a thick envelope delivered certified mail to the HOA office and copied to Timbercrest Development. It cited state water code, county property boundaries, and the absence of any recorded easement granting access. It demanded removal of all structures and cessation of access within 30 days. The response was immediate. Bryce called me that evening. "Daniel," he began, voice smooth as ever, "we received your attorney's letter. I assumed you would. I think we both want to avoid unnecessary escalation. Installing steel posts in my lake feels like escalation." There was a pause. Our residents purchased cabins with the understanding that the lake was part of the lifestyle. If we suddenly remove access, you're going to have 97 very unhappy homeowners. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. They should be unhappy with whoever sold them something that wasn't included. He shifted tactics. "What if we formalize it? A shared use agreement. The HOA pays you an annual access fee. We handle maintenance on the dock. You gain predictable income. We maintain community harmony." Predictable income. I almost admired the framing. "Bryce," I said, "water control isn't a seasonal convenience. If someone drowns off that dock, it's my insurance. If erosion increases from traffic, it's my shoreline. If contamination happens, it's my responsibility. You're asking me to trade long-term liability for a yearly check. We'd indemnify you. Paper indemnification doesn't change physics." Silence again. He tried one more angle. "Think about goodwill, Daniel. You live here too." That one stung because it was half true. I do live here. I shop at the same grocery store. I pass Timbercrest residents at the hardware aisle. I don't enjoy being the guy who says no. But goodwill doesn't rewrite a deed. The deadline passed without removal. In fact, usage increased. By early summer, the dock looked like a marina. Paddle boards lined up. Kids jumping off the end. Someone had strung solar lights along the rails. On weekends, I'd hear laughter drifting across the water while I sat on my own porch feeling like a stranger on my own property. My neighbor Hank, who's known me since high school, stopped by one evening. "You gonna let that keep going?" he asked, nodding toward the western bank. "No. You waiting for what?" "For the right moment." He spit into the grass and said, "You're nicer than me." Maybe. Or maybe I was just hoping they'd blink first. They didn't. So Laura and I petitioned the county for enforcement. That meant inspections, hearings, paperwork. It wasn't fast. Nothing involving property law ever is. But once it starts moving, it builds its own momentum. A county inspector named Rachel Kim came out in late July. She walked the shoreline with us, reviewed the deed, cross-referenced the survey, took photos of the dock. "This is clearly within your boundary," she said. "And I don't see any recorded easement." "There isn't one." She nodded. "I'll file my report." A hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. I won't pretend I slept well the night before. Not because I doubted the law, but because I knew whatever happened would ripple beyond paperwork. If enforcement went through, 97 households would feel the impact. If it didn't, my family's ownership would be weakened permanently. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Fluorescent lights. Wood paneling from the 80s. Bryce sat at one table with an attorney I hadn't met before, younger guy in a gray suit flipping through a binder. I sat beside Laura, who looked like she was about to grade a paper she already knew the outcome of. Bryce's attorney argued community integration, implied reliance by homeowners, economic impact of restricted access. It sounded impressive if you didn't know the backbone of it was assumption. When it was Laura's turn, she stood and simply walked the board through the deed language. Line by line. Shoreline. Basin. Inflow. Outflow. No easement. No recorded shared use. She presented Miguel's survey with laser precision. "Property rights are not suggestions," she said calmly. "They are recorded facts." The board recessed for deliberation. 20 minutes that felt like 2 hours. When they returned, the chair cleared his throat. "Based on the recorded documents and inspection findings, Alder Creek Lake is classified as private property under county code. The timber crest dock constitutes unauthorized encroachment. The HOA is ordered to remove the structure within 14 days and cease any marketing implying lake access. I didn't look at Bryce right away. I just let the word settle. 14 days. Outside in the parking lot, Bryce approached me. "You've made your point," he said. No smile this time. I didn't make the point. The deed did. "You realize this isn't over socially, right?" I held his gaze. It was never social. Removal crews arrived exactly 12 days later. Flatbed truck. Waiters. Impact drivers in reverse this time. I stood on my side of the shoreline and watched each steel post pulled free, dripping mud and lake water back into the basin. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. By sunset, the dock was gone. Just faint disturbances in the sediment where it had been. The next week, Timber Crest's website changed. The sunset photo remained, but the caption shifted. Scenic views of a privately owned lake. Access not included. I reinforced my shoreline with clearly marked boundary posts, subtle but visible. Installed discrete trail cameras near the main footpaths. Locked the inflow gate housing with a heavier steel clasp. Not because I wanted to build a fortress, but because I understood now that assumption fills any gap you leave open. Cabins still lined the ridge. Smoke still curled from chimneys at dusk. Kids still rode bikes along the gravel loop. But the water was quiet again. And for a while, I thought that was the end of it. For a few weeks after the doc came out, things went still in a way that almost felt staged, like everyone was waiting for the next line in a script nobody wanted to read out loud. The lake settled back into itself. Mornings were quiet again. Just wind through reeds, the low hum of insects, the occasional splash of a base breaking the surface. From my porch I could see the ridge where the cabins sat, lights flicking on at dusk like a string of lanterns. It looked peaceful. It looked almost normal. But normal had shifted. I started noticing the way people in town looked at me. Not hostile exactly, just aware. At the grocery store, a woman I didn't recognize said, "You're the lake guy, right?" "I guess I am." "Must be nice," she said, not smiling. I wasn't sure what that meant. Must be nice to own something? Must be nice to say no? Must be nice to win? Hank came by again one evening with a six-pack and sat on the dock my dad built in the 90s. "You rattled some cages," he said. "I didn't mean to rattle anything. Doesn't matter what you meant. People paid good money up there. They thought they were buying waterfront. They didn't." He cracked open a beer and handed one to me. Doesn't change what they feel. And that was the part one hadn't prepared for. Legally, everything was clean. The county ruling was clear. The dock was gone. The website had been updated. On paper, the story was over. But stories don't live on paper. They live in people. About a month later, I got a knock on my front door. Not a board member. Not Bryce. It was a couple from Cabin 22. Early 30s, baby strapped to the dad's chest, exhaustion written across both their faces. "Hi," the woman said softly. "We're not here to argue. Okay. We just wanted to understand." I invited them onto the porch. The baby stared at the water like it was a moving painting. "We moved here from Phoenix," the dad said. "Sold everything. The developer told us we'd have lake access. That's why we chose this place instead of somewhere cheaper." I nodded. "When the dock got pulled out, it felt like something was taken from us," the woman added. "Not by you personally. Just taken." I leaned back and looked out at the surface. "You ever read your closing documents?" I asked gently. They glanced at each other. We trusted what we were told. That sentence hung there between us. I told them about my grandfather buying the land when nobody else wanted it. About clearing brush by hand. About my dad reinforcing the spillway after a flood in '82 nearly took the whole South Bank with it. About insurance premiums and liability policies, and the one time a teenager from town snuck in at night and almost drowned before we found him. "This isn't a decoration," I said. "It's a responsibility. If I open it up without control, I'm not just sharing a view. I'm taking on risk for 97 households I didn't invite." They listened. Really listened. "We don't think you're evil," the dad said quietly. "We just wish someone had been honest from the start." So did I. After they left, I sat there longer than usual. The sun dipped low, turning the water copper. I thought about how easy it would have been to take Bryce's offer. A tidy annual check. A handshake agreement. Call it community cooperation and move on. But every compromise has a tail. Once access is normalized, it doesn't shrink. It expands. A dock becomes two. Two become a swim platform. Someone brings a motorized boat. Someone sues when their kid scrapes a knee on submerged rock. And somewhere down that line, the deed starts to feel less solid. A week later, I ran into Bryce at the county building. He looked tired, less polished than before. "You cost us a lot of money," he said without greeting. I didn't respond right away. "You cost your homeowners more," I finally said. He exhaled. "Developers pushed the lake angle hard. Sales were slow until they leaned into it. By the time we realized access wasn't automatic, contracts were signed. Backing off would have killed momentum. So you doubled down." He didn't deny it. "You ever think about how this makes you look?" he asked. "Every day? And I'd rather look stubborn than lose what my family built because I was afraid of being unpopular." He studied me for a second like he was trying to decide whether I was naive or immovable. "You know they're talking about trying to buy you out, right?" he said. "By the lake? Or at least secure a permanent easement." I almost smiled. "They can try." That conversation followed me home. Not as a threat exactly, more like a reminder that ownership isn't just about fences and filings. It's about endurance. The offer started small. A letter from a group of homeowners proposing a pooled purchase of limited daytime access. Then a more formal inquiry from Timber Crest Development about acquiring a shoreline strip to create a controlled entry point. Each time, I declined. Not angrily, not dramatically, just consistently. And here's where it gets complicated. Because sometimes, late at night, I'd stand at the water's edge and wonder if I was holding too tight. If maybe my grandfather, stubborn as he was, would have found a way to charge a fair fee and call it neighborly. If maybe there was a version of this story where kids from the ridge learned to fish under my supervision and nobody felt cheated. But then I'd picture the steel post going into the lake bed without so much as a conversation, and that doubt would harden again. This wasn't about sharing. It was about assumption. Fall came quick that year. Leaves rimmed the shoreline in red and gold. The cabins on the ridge looked almost postcard perfect, smoke rising into crisp air. From a distance, you'd never guessed there had been a fight at all. One evening near dusk, I noticed a small figure down by the western bank. A kid, maybe 10, sitting on a rock with a fishing pole cast into the shallows. No dock, no crowd, just him. I walked over slowly. "Hey there." He looked up, nervous. "My mom said we're not supposed to be here." She's right. I expected him to pack up and run. Instead, he just reeled in his line and said, "I just wanted to see if there were fish." "There are." He hesitated. "Are you the guy who owns it?" "Yeah." He nodded like he was confirming a rumor. "Can I fish if I ask?" It was such a simple question. No brochure, no legal argument. Just a kid in a lake. "Maybe sometimes," I said. "But you gotta ask first. And you gotta respect it." He grinned like I'd handed him something bigger than permission. "Okay." I watched him head back up the slope toward the cabins, small against the wide hill. And that's the part nobody writes into the paperwork. The gray space between private and shared. Between right and generous. Between law and neighbor. The dock is gone. The marketing language is fixed. The boundary posts stand quiet along the shoreline. On record, the lake remains exactly where it has always been, under my name. But the story doesn't end with a gavel. It lingers in conversations at the hardware store, in sideways glances at the diner, in letters that still show up twice a year asking if I've reconsidered. So here's what I want to know from you. If you were in my place, would you have done the same? Would you have enforced every inch of that deed, knowing it would turn neighbors into critics? Or would you have taken the money, signed a shared access agreement, and called it compromise? Is ownership about protection at all costs? Or is it about how much you're willing to bend before something breaks? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more than you think. And if you've ever been in a fight over land, over boundaries, over something that was legally yours but emotionally complicated, I want to hear that too. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't proving you're right. It's living with it afterward.